Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced, and I'm going to post this episode as part of my opinions podcast and my economics podcast, just because there are going to be bits about this where I'm talking about economics and parts of this where I am expressing my opinion. Okay, so keep in mind, my opinion is my opinion. I'm not asserting that what I'm saying is absolutely factual, but there will be a mix of sort of economic facts and concepts that'll be intertwined there. So I think it'll be useful for both podcasts. But what I'm doing is I'm reflecting on another podcast from The Weeds, the case for banning millionaires. Okay, and here they had political philosopher Ingrid Robins, basically who refers to herself as a Limitarian. So basically, for the first part of this episode, what I want to do is just explain what her argument is, and then I'll explain sort of some of my concerns and criticisms of that argument. Okay, it's always important to kind of make sure that you understand the point before you dispute the point. I think too many people rush too quickly into trying to dispute something from their lens without taking the time to understand it from the lens of the person who's delivering the argument. So this argument is about, well, the basic thesis is that there should be a hard limit on basically what was unclear is whether this is income or net worth. So basically, Ingrid mentioned two limits, a political limit and a moral limit. So the idea is a political limit would be one that would be enforced politically. So basically, from what I understood, is essentially a progressive tax that would basically prevent you from having any income or net worth. Again, wasn't clear on that point. Above 10 million, I have to imagine it would be income. So you wouldn't be able to make more than 10 million in a year. After that, everything else would just be confiscated. And then two, a moral limit. So saying, hey, people should morally try to limit themselves to 1 million a year. Okay, because arguing that there's no material benefit. And again, I'm going to dispute these points to an extent. And I understand the case in the sense that, basically after $1 million, you can probably afford the best healthcare. You can afford a pretty nice home in the best areas. I don't make near that much and can start seeing that, you get to a point as your career grows that you're starting to sort of maximize getting sort of the things you want and the most of your wants and needs. So I can definitely see myself, if I were making $1 million a year, I probably wouldn't have too much in the way of concerns. But again, also, there's other I would say I'm at an income level where within sort of my existing paradigm, my wants and needs are met. But chances are, if I made more, my paradigm might change. I might participate in activities or in things that I wouldn't have participated in before, or have problems I wouldn't have had before. So there's a sort of unseen, change that I'm unaware of if I were to make more than I currently do. Cool. Okay, but that's basically her thesis. And the reason being because of the case against inequality. And generally the case against inequality basically states that, when you start seeing a bigger gap between the wealthiest people in society and the poorest people in society, this is going to have a couple of different outcomes. One, there's political outcomes, where basically the political arrangements in society become heavily controlled by that very, very extremely wealthy minority. Basically, which generally is going to end up serving oftentimes their interests, which could then cause issues with, being able to execute policy for environmental purposes, social welfare policies, whatnot. So basically, it becomes you have more poor, and it's hard to serve those poor, and harder to move policies in directions that might benefit people more broadly. That's the argument. Yes. Okay. And also the fact that then there's this moral argument that basically that people, like, for example, as a libertarian like myself, I might say, people earn what they earn, and basically saying, well, did they, did they control where in the world were they born? You're probably going to have better outcomes if you're born in a first world country versus a third world country. Did you control how you were born? Oh, well, not everyone chooses whether they were born with all their limbs. And if you have all your limbs, chances are you're going to have better economic prospects. okay, or if something happens that affects your learning capability, or one of a million things, or whether you're born at all. Okay, all these things are going to affect sort of your outcomes. Who your parents are, what do your parents believe in, what do your parents think, where do you go to school. I mean, every sort of external thing in your life has an impact on you that you don't necessarily always control. Okay, and I don't deny that point. Okay, there is a huge aspect of luck in everybody's life. Okay, there's a lot that you do control, especially as you get older. And again, one of the counterpoints is that oftentimes some of the time of your life that's going to most impact your ability to make better decisions later in life are going to be during the time of your life where you have the least control. And during the statistic that was mentioned in the podcast was the first 1,000 days of life. So generally in the first 1,000 days of life, you really are at the whims of your environment, whoever's raising you, your family, your community. You have very little control over your life. And it's going to be during that time that you're going to form a lot of the basic intuitions, knowledge, skills, ability to learn, that'll affect your ability to sort of make the decisions for you to earn things later on. Okay, so again, I don't deny any of these points. These are fair. Okay, but I mean that applies to everybody everywhere. Okay, and yes, I would say I was very fortunate. I grew up, poor, but I had a pretty good supportive family in the sense that people who cared and people who were involved in my life. I went to schools that I felt did a pretty decent job of educating me. So I've had a lot of things that were not necessarily in my control. I had no control over what school I chose to, at least in those early years. And no control over who my parents were. And those things kind of worked out for me. There was things that didn't work out for me. Okay, my parents didn't stay together, which in hindsight probably was more of a good thing than a bad thing. But there was I did grow up very impoverished. Basically, oftentimes eating food from like food pantries and not wearing the same clothes for several days in a row and not having really much else choice as far as clothes or food. And again, that level of poverty isn't the worst level of poverty there is in the world. Okay, there are definitely people and that's something that, that I'm grateful for. That if I was born in the United States, where the level of the lifestyle of being poor in the United States is still a lot better than the lifestyle of the poor in many places. Okay, so even there, I was privileged per se. Okay, but I don't think luck necessarily makes you basically imposes some sort of obligation on you. I just don't. I don't in a sense, I agree with a lot of that we want the world to be a better place and that we should try to be responsible for each other more on a moral level. I don't like the word obligation. I don't like it. There's too many things going on in an individual's life that may or may not take priority, and there's complications in an individual's life that sit there and say, hey, you might be a wealthy person, but you might be having so many different things that are on your plate and going on in your life that you may not be able to do all the magical things that people in this sort of point of view want you to do to benefit society. And that doesn't mean, and again, I get the counter argument being like, oh, we're not asking you to use more of your time. We're just asking you to just not make too much money. So you make a certain amount, you just give it. Okay. And here's where I started seeing a lot of problems. Okay. So one, I can see the argument that yes, at a certain point, you're really, as an individual to your individual life, you're not going to get that much marginal benefit over the next additional dollar. I mean, there comes a point where you don't need to go buy yourself a private island or a private jet. You might want to, and I personally don't care if you want to, and you should be able to. But I mean, it's not necessarily going to the cost, the resources that get expounded. Again, value is subjective, so this is me imposing my normative values on that, and that's something to keep in mind. Again, just because I think something is more valuable or less valuable. It doesn't necessarily mean it is. At the end of the day, like, value is subjective, so it's determined by the people who exchange. Now, there are clear outcomes, okay? But again, there's a difference between sort of value and costs, per se, okay? Someone can say, hey, something costs $100, but is it worth $100 to me? If it's not, then I won't buy it. So value is subjective, okay? Every individual is going to see things at different values, and oftentimes we look at economics imposing sort of our lens of value on everything. But knowing that value is subjective and that people make decisions based on the relative value of things in their mind, from their perspective, from their lens, you can start thinking through some of the ramifications. So, for example, right now, yes, there's people who make billions of dollars or tens of millions of dollars, a lot of money in a year. And it is a factor. Now, while all the different decisions and factors that kind of got them to that point may not have all been under control, but some of the things they did to create that wealth are under their control in the sense of choosing, like, hey, where am I going to invest my time? Where am I going to invest my resources? And people make those choices based on expectations of, certain rewards. Okay, so basically, am I going to invest $10 million in something expecting only to get $1,000 back? Probably not. But would I invest myself $10 million in something expecting to get $1 million back? Maybe. Okay, at 10%, it's pretty decent, a pretty good return. So, there's this mix between reward and risk. Okay, so a lot of times the bets, the projects that yield the most benefits oftentimes can be some of the riskiest, because they're oftentimes things that are identifying things that are not on anybody's radar, like defining new sort of product classes, or new or taking advantage of resources in ways that we've never done before or thought to do before. So you're oftentimes taking a very large amount of risk in innovation. So that means you can lose a lot, and which means to compensate that you should be rewarded a lot. And again, notice in the when I take a look back at that conversation with Ingrid, there was a conversation about how to limit the rewards, but there was no conversation of limiting the losses. So in that case, if you're telling somebody that, hey, I can lose $1 billion, but I can only make 10, those types of projects aren't going to be the ones that people will undertake. Okay. Now again, people should not undertake those projects without doing their due diligence, and but there's going to be certain people who get to a point in their life where they've made so many successful decisions and been able to identify successful projects. And again, how they've developed that ability to be able to identify good projects and good opportunities, not necessarily 100% them. Again, their parents, their community, where they were born, all that stuff is fair. But they got to that point. They have the ability to determine sort of what is a successful project. And once that is the case, okay, they are providing a value. So if you can successfully keep identifying successful things to invest in and identifying successful businesses, you are creating value. I mean, and it's not just, you're creating jobs and whatnot. You're taking resources and turning them into something that's more valuable to more people. Okay, or else those businesses wouldn't generally be successful for these investments to mature. Okay, but if you screw with the risk-reward calculation, saying, okay, hey, we're going to limit your reward, but we're not going to limit your risk, which I don't think you should limit risk. Okay, I think you need and I think that's a big problem now, where we do limit the risk too much while not limiting the reward. Okay, you will cause changes. Okay, the total dollar amount invested may not change. Okay, because money's got to get invested somewhere. But where it will be invested will change. And that will change the pace of rewards, okay? And that would create a slower growth rate. Now, granted, I'm not a big growth rate type person, because at the end of the day, the growth rate is just the total amount spent. I can imagine people being happy at a lower size economy, if their consumption level, if their consumption norms were different. Okay, for example, like if everyone consumed the way I consume, chances are the U.S. GDP would be a lot lower. Because there's just not as many things that I feel like I need or want. Okay, not everybody, people like to buy the fancy couch, the fancy TV, the fancy whatnot. That's fine. that's to each their own. Okay. But I can, but at the end of the day, is again, it's going to be, still, even in that situation, there's a grander number of people, and there needs to be the projects to keep them busy. And I know the counter argument would be like, well, we can just have the government, employ everybody to, build the roads that need building and whatnot. One, that's assuming that everybody wants to go do construction work. Okay, that you're just assuming everybody's dreams and hopes and ambitions. Two, again, there's an assumption that the government's going to somehow be a better institution at implementing these kind of programs, and somehow has better incentives. And I just don't see that. So again, while I could be sympathetic to the idea that, hey, maybe there's some point where, okay, hey, we cut off the spigot. The thing is that where does the excess water go? Now, if it goes in the government coffers, oftentimes that just means you're going to end up having grander amounts of corruption in government, because it's just that bigger pot of gold that is controlled through politics. So politics becomes corrupt, and you can say, well, we'll limit, donations and, all this stuff. But people find ways to influence each other. Like, influence is not just purely economic. Yes, if you're economically successful, you will develop a level of political power. But also, there are several other ways you can develop power over others. There's sexual power, where basically, people might be more willing to do what you say because they're attracted to you. There is social power, where basically you are some sort of pillar of society, whether you are a very beloved political figure, a beloved religious figure, a cultural figure, in media. You're some figure that has a soapbox to have more influence. Okay, them exercising that influence, how is that any different than someone exercising their influence through donations or through gifts? Okay, so everyone's just kind of accumulate influence and spend it, and oftentimes for their own interests. So all you're doing is you're just changing sort of who has the advantage, or imbalancing who has the advantage. And I do believe naturally things do balance out. Our bodies do, and I do believe that, like, minus a lot of interventions, you can see the mechanism by which economies would balance themselves out. It wouldn't always be pretty, but oftentimes balanced. But at the same time, and I see that with the body as well. But at the same time, you can also see that at some point your body might get so imbalanced that you absolutely need medical intervention, right? You might get to a point where, like, hey, if you had been allowing your body to behave in a more balanced way, you may have not ever gotten cancer. Okay, possibly. So again, prevention is one thing. So I do, from a libertarian point of view, feel like a freer market, freer world prevents that level of imbalance. But I can fathom a world where basically things get so imbalanced that now intervention is required to get back to that possibility of balance, in the sense, okay, hey, in the sense of cancer, you might need chemo to get rid of the cancer. But then once you're doing that, again, adopting a healthy, natural lifestyle becomes imperative. So in the case, like, hey, you might have to hit some sort of reset button on the economy, that then going forward, you adopt those sort of free market principles. But again, I don't trust the political process to ever be able to do something like that. So I generally just feel like just kind of getting politics away from people's, or not even necessarily, because getting politics out of it is also a hard thing to kind of fathom. What it really comes down to is determining whether getting people to get involved in their own lives and believe in the power they have over their own lives as much as possible, so that way they can make those differences in their own life. Because at the end of the day, like, all the factors, all the things in play that are out there to control you or to limit your options and your possibilities, they exist, they're going to exist, but doesn't necessarily mean you have no agency and you have no power. And sort of helping people embrace that agency and power and trying to make use of it, to me, is the most productive use of sort of my activism, my voice, my time. Whether it's through educating people, whether my time educating people in finance or educating people in technology, whether it is just sort of just speaking people in an encouraging way and telling people that they have value and they can, that there's always, there's to never give up. Like, to me, that's just a much more beneficial, because at the end of the day, like, the political winds, the cycles, they're going to play out the way they're going to play out. There's going to be the really good periods and the really bad periods, and right now we're kind of going through one of the darker periods, or at least leading up to one of the darker periods, it looks like, when you take a look at global politics. But at the end of the day, like, you still have the power to make your life a good life and live a good life, to care about people, to whatnot, and you just keep it simple. Like, at the end of the day, like, you don't have control over everything. There are going to be things that set you back. You're going to have certain penalties in life and certain privileges in life. But it's up to you and how you take that and turn it into something that you feel good about. And that's generally going to be sort of my perspective. But yeah, so that was my thinking on this. Hopefully you guys enjoyed that. My name is Alex Merced. See you all later. Have a great day and enjoy.